So at this time, I'd like to invite Soren Fellow Eric Verheij to the podium, who will introduce Professor Sullivan.
All right. So first, I'd like to thank everyone for being here, and thank Pete and the rest of the CEC for making this event possible. So it's my privilege to offer the introduction today. Meghan Sullivan is Professor of Philosophy and the Reverend John O'Brien Collegiate Chair here at the University of Notre Dame, and serves as Director of the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. We're also proud to say that Professor Sullivan is a member of the Faculty Advisory Committee of our own Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, and a dear friend of the Soren Fellow Program. Professor Sullivan earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia, a graduate degree in philosophy from Oxford University, where she also studied as a Rhodes Scholar, and her PhD from Rutgers University. In her first book, Time Biases, was published by Oxford University Press in the summer of 2018. You very well have come to know Professor Sullivan through her implementation of the God and the Good Life course, which originated through her collaboration with a team of students, faculty, and staff to design a course intended to immerse students in the great debates about the nature of belief and doubt, what kind of life is worth living, and what exactly morality requires of us. Since 2016, over 1,500 students have taken the course, and it continues to grow. In 2018, the program received an $806,000 grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to expand the course and adapt it to a curricular model used by faculty across the country. This fall, Professor Sullivan also team taught an FTT and philosophy exploratory seminar about NBC's The Good Place called The Good Class, and hosted the show's creator, Michael Schur, for a discussion on virtue ethics titled, Can Television Make Us Better People? Today, it's our privilege to welcome Professor Sullivan as she speaks on the book that changed her life, Plato's Republic. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sullivan.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm always mildly shocked when people would stay after class or come voluntarily at 5 p.m. on a Thursday to talk about Plato. So I think that speaks volumes about the Soren Fellows and the community here at Notre Dame, and it definitely warms my heart as a philosophy professor. Did everybody get a math problem? That's going to be crucial. That's like my big joke for this talk. So if you don't have the math problem, you're going to miss the joke. If you didn't get one, they're in the back there. When I was asked by Pete to give a talk on the book that changed my life, I did not hesitate at all to think about what book was most important for me in college. It was, without a doubt, Plato's Republic. How many people here have read The Republic? So you guys should be like mildly terrified. I'm really shocked that you guys came tonight to hear a speaker that would say that the Republic changed her life. Because if you've read The Republic, that should sound a bit like fascism changed my life, or like Scientology changed my life. The Republic is a completely crazy book. The major themes of The Republic, if you need like the Cliff Notes version to take home with you tonight, are Plato thinks that democracy has failed, that the best way to rebuild civil society is to start with all of the children. Really, everyone over the age of 11 is a lost cause. At one point in the laws, he suggests just taking everybody over the age of 11 out into the fields and killing them, and restarting with children, and separating them out based on natural abilities, and educating the smartest ones in these really intensive educational programs that creates philosopher kings and queens who will then rule over all of the others in this completely rigid totalitarian state. There's also some weird religious mathematics that he teaches you in the middle part of it. It's a totally strange book. Karl Popper is like the biggest hater on Plato, probably, at least in the 20th century, and he has some great quotes about how much he hates Plato's Republic, so I'll share these with you guys. First, what a monument of human smallness is this idea of the philosopher king. What a contrast between that and the simplicity and humaneness of Socrates, Plato's teacher, who warned the statesmen against the danger of being dazzled by their own power or excellence and wisdom, who tried to teach the statesmen what matters most, that we're all frail and meant to be humble human beings. Popper says, Plato became unconsciously the pioneer of the many propagandists who often in good faith developed the technique of appealing to moral or humanitarian sentiments for anti-humanitarian or immoral purposes. And Popper's not the only person that thought Plato's like the original bad guy of philosophy. He has really extreme views. He's extremely critical of other people who disagree with him. And a lot of people think Plato's the figure to be resisted. How many people have read Brave New World? I mean, there's a way of reading the Republic where it's got a similar structure of Brave New World. Let's create the perfect society and then subdue anybody who disagrees with it. And the really disturbing things about Plato is, like, unlike Huxley or George Orwell, Plato really seems to believe that this is a way forward, that we should create a society like this. So how on earth could the Republic be your favorite book? I think it makes me nervous about my own character and caused me some introspection that I would choose this as such an important book. I first read the Republic. This edition, actually, that you guys have before you is the edition that I got when I was 19. I was a student at the University of Virginia. I was taking a class called Ancient and Medieval Political Theory with George Klosko. If you look on the back of the book, and this impressed me so much when I was 19, you'll see that Klosko has a quote saying that he really prefers this Gruba translation of the Republic, which I didn't even know what it meant to, like, prefer a translation when I was 19, but I was very impressed that my professor had gotten to endorse the book that we were reading. Professor Klosko is a New Yorker. He had studied all his life at Columbia, which has this really great books program, before he'd come to the University of Virginia. And his superpower as a professor was his capacity to make the dead come back to life. Like, to make you feel like if you don't know Plato's thinking about democracy, you will not survive in the 21st century. He made these ideas feel really alive. And I think that is absolutely one of the ways that I fell in love with Plato, is just the fact that I had the fortune of having a professor when I was 19 who was totally obsessed with the Republic and just saw all the beauty and coolness in the midst of this really extreme book. Another thing that happened over the course of college is I changed a lot as a person. And one of the things I'm going to encourage you guys to do tonight as you read or reread the Republic is to think about other philosophical messages that are in the background of this book. And I think one of the key messages, and the one that has stuck with me for the last 15, 20 years, is this message about what it means to want to change and to want to be somebody that desires things that are really different from what you've known. And so that's going to be my theme of the talk tonight. I'm going to pick up on three big parts of the Republic that I think help me as an individual think about this process of transformation and are genuinely interesting and funny and raise really important philosophical questions. And I'll tell you why I love them. And then hopefully that'll be an invitation for you to talk and think more about this book and maybe look at it in a new light. So that's my plan. And in the meantime, I'll also do a little bit of therapy to try to figure out why I like this book so much, because I am genuinely mystified. A couple basics about Plato if you're rusty. First off, I should warn you, I am not an ancient philosophy scholar. I do not read Greek. I'm a total Plato fangirl. So I'm just the kind of person who reads Plato because I love it, not the kind of person who has any scholarly credential to teach you about Plato. My area of philosophy is 20th and 21st century metaphysics, which could not be more different from Plato's world. So take all this with a grain of salt. You should, if you love the truth, you should fact check everything you're being told here tonight. But from what I know about Plato, he's writing the Republic in 375 BC. He lives in Athens, he lives in ancient Greece. Ancient Greece is a democracy. They basically invented democracy, which is pretty cool. It's also not going super well. He watches his teacher Socrates get killed by the Athenian government. Why is Socrates killed? Anybody remember? Those of you guys who've taken God in the good life, please, for the love of God, raise your hand. What are some of the reasons Socrates gets himself killed? Yeah, what's your name?
Nicholas.
Nicholas.
For corrupting the youth of Athens.
Corrupting the youth, this is what every philosophy professor hopes to be charged with someday. Corrupting the youth of Notre Dame, corrupting the youth of Athens. How did he corrupt the youth, Nicholas? This is the big charge against him.
I think teaching philosophy, I'm not as familiar with these things.
Yeah, that's right. He was teaching them to question, and this was really great in Athens until it wasn't. So Athens, it's a small democracy. It is really important if you live in a government where everybody gets to vote on everything that you be really persuasive before votes. Right? So if you're in Athens, we're deciding if we're going to go to war with Sparta. People are going to die. Fortunes will be made or lost depending on this war. And we're going to make the decision based on a common vote after a bunch of public deliberation. The people who are going to win are the people who are going to be really good at persuading other people and who are going to be really confident in their beliefs and really good at argument. So Athens is a place where a lot of people are portraying themselves as experts, certainly experts on questions like morality and how Athens should be run. And Socrates is going around and he's just asking skeptical questions of everyone. Somebody says, I'm an expert on wars. I can tell you if we're capable of winning a war with Sparta. Socrates finds this military general and just starts asking him questions about strategy, and eventually Socrates is so good at asking questions, so good at raising objections, that it turns out that this really famous general has no idea what he's talking about, and he goes away disgraced. And Socrates is teaching young people to do this too. He's teaching young people to ask questions about whether or not Athens is actually a good government. The Athenians are super proud of themselves. Invented democracy, they invented geometry, they've got this amazing navy, and Socrates is going around telling young people, are we that great? Is there a better form of government? Eventually the Athenians get sick of him. They also accuse him of being an atheist. They accuse him of not really making any sense and going around and discouraging people from being able to work together. So they put him to death. This really bothers Plato. And one of the causes that Plato takes up that inspires the Republic is this cause of trying to understand what it means to be really concerned with the truth and not to be just concerned with appearances. And in particular, not to be concerned with the kinds of appearances that involve like just getting along in society. So that was a huge thing for Socrates, is not, and one of the reasons Socrates is like a hero of so many philosophers down the road, is Socrates was willing to say, even if it means going against prevailing culture, I'm going to ask the hard questions because I care so much about the truth. Plato takes that idea to heart. Plato writes dialogues. And the early dialogues, again, I'm not a scholar of ancient philosophy, so go Wikipedia this later on. But the early dialogues, Plato seems to be trying to capture questions Socrates was really asking about the nature of justice, the nature of courage, the nature of mathematics to people who were experts. About a third of the way into Plato's writing career, he gets sick of trying to capture Socrates' views on things, and he just starts using Socrates to be a puppet for his own views. And by the time we get to the Republic, we're getting Plato's views on things. Socrates famously thought he didn't know anything. He wasn't going to take any position. Plato has very firm positions on things. How should we create the perfect city? What is the structure of a human soul? And he's going to use Socrates as a character. He's going to be kind of introducing questions through Socrates, but the Republic is a book that's got a lot of substantive views in it. The warm-up for the Republic, or if you don't have time to read the Republic but want some of the good stuff that comes from it, is this dialogue called the Gorgias, where Plato has Socrates sparring with increasingly serious sophists. The sophists in ancient Athens were basically like debate coaches, or I kind of read them as like college admissions essay coaches. They were people who, if you're a rich family in Athens, you need your son to be really good at arguing. Why? Because you live in a democracy, and so if your son's really good at arguing, he's going to be able to argue positions that people are going to vote for, and that's going to increase the power and good fortune for your family. So you want your kids to have power. They need to be really good at persuading people to do it. How do you teach your kids to be persuasive? You hire a sophist who puts them through debate camp and teaches them how to make good arguments. Socrates and Plato think the sophists are wrecking Athens. And why is that? Well, think about what we say about these college admissions tutors now. They're getting too good at their jobs. So they're teaching students to basically argue for any position just based on whatever their personal whims are. And as a result, these guys think Athenians have lost touch with what it means to care about the truth. So if you see like a common theme, and especially as Plato really gets ramped up in the dialogues, it's Socrates having fights with people who don't seem to be concerned with the truth, but do seem to be really concerned with their ability to like argue beautifully or argue well. And the two worst sophists in the whole tradition are, to my mind, this guy named Callicles, who comes up in the dialogue right before the Republic starts, and this guy named Thrasymachus, who's the main character in the first chapter of the Republic. So the Republic, it's going to read like a bunch of plays, Socrates having arguments with people. In the very first chapter of the Republic, Socrates is having an argument with this sophist called Thrasymachus. And Thrasymachus is basically, he's like Nietzsche. He's like Nietzsche in ancient Greece. He's defending the position that what is right, what is just whatever the most powerful people say it is. And so if you care about anything in this world, if you want to live a good life, what you should be dedicating yourself to, if you're really honest with yourself, is getting as much power as possible, because might makes right. And Socrates thinks this is garbage. He thinks that you should care about the truth, you should care about the good. And he's trying to argue with Thrasymachus. The reason why Thrasymachus is such a great interlocutor, such a great debater, is because Thrasymachus is willing to follow his position where it leads, and he's willing to keep arguing even if it makes him like seem like an immoral guy. So If you read the first chapter of the Republic, you can kind of read that as a self-contained debate just in this question of what it means to really care about the truth, and you kind of get Plato's views about sophistry. There's also a lot of really funny quotes about Plato and sophistry. I was just thinking about this morning. How many of you guys feel like if you hear another news report about the 2020 election, you're going to lose your minds? Like, just like media and the politics, nobody's concerned with truth, there's all this fake news. Plato's got exactly the same complaints throughout the Republic and in a bunch of his writings. Here's one from a letter that he wrote after he wrote the Republic. He says, "The more I reflected on what was happening in Athens and all of the political talk and what the sophists are doing, upon what kind of men were becoming active in politics and the state of our laws and our customs, and the older I grew, the more I realized how difficult it was to manage a city's affairs well." He talks a little bit about how he thinks young people are particularly susceptible to this fake news craze. And this is actually in the Republic, so this is in book 7. Here's Plato on why he thinks you should be really careful when you start teaching people your age about logic. He says, "Don't you realize what great evil comes from dialectic, from logic, as it's currently taught to people, when we teach people just how to argue rhetorically? I don't suppose that it's escaped your notice that when young people get their first taste of arguments, they misuse them by treating them as a kind of game of contradiction. They imitate those who've refuted them by refuting others themselves, and like puppies, they enjoy dragging and tearing those around them with their arguments." So Plato's nervous also that these debate coaches, that the figures that are held up as important in Athenian culture, they're teaching people how to like spar with each other or how to defend literally any view to the death, but they're not teaching them how to care about the truth. And in fact, some of the sophists are going around saying the truth is irrelevant. The truth, capital T truth, is just whatever the person who's winning says it is. This disgusts Plato. He thinks that this is like one of the huge failures of Athenian culture. One of the things he's trying to do in the Republic with all the weird math and geometry stuff that happens in the middle is remind you that you do actually care about the truth. And Plato's in a tough position when he's arguing with the sophists. Like, think about how hard is it to use logic itself to try to convince somebody who doesn't care about the truth to care about the truth. Like, if somebody's really good at logic, they can do any kind of ninja maneuver to try to find a problem with your argument, and Plato's aware of this. So he's wondering, how do you make people care about the truth again? It can't just be by giving them more arguments, because arguments are becoming the problem in Athens. One of the things Plato does with the Republic that's really cool is try to remind people in other ways that, no, you do actually care about the truth. So here's why I gave you the logic puzzle. This is the first lesson that's great about Plato is he has tricky ways to remind you that you do care about the truth. One of the things he talks about quite a bit in the Republic is how important it is to teach young people to solve math problems. And you read this and you're just like, I don't understand why we're talking about geometry right now. Famously, over the doorway, I don't know if this is true, but this is one of the legends. Over the doorway of the academy, Plato had let no one unaware of geometry enter here. So that was going to be his admission standard, that you know about geometry. Why is that so important? I have a colleague at Wesleyan, Tushar Irani. He's a professor of ancient ethics at Wesleyan. And he has convinced me that this is a really good route to understanding Plato's thinking on this. Caring about geometry is one of the ways that we initially warm up our truth muscle. So how many of you guys got the puzzle when you came in and think you got the answer? So we'll come to you in a second. How many of you guys are like totally stumped? All right, let's take a second. Let's actually just take a second and confer for a minute with your neighbor about how you're trying to solve the puzzle. And let's see if we can get any more hands for like getting the answer. So let's just take 1 minute to do this.
So,
See if you can help each other.
so we know that this is 7 and 10, right? And then just by knowing that the Greeks love proportion, it's really clearly clear that this is probably going to be the size of I was seeing from one close and then decided seeing that which then means 4 by 7, which unfortunately is small. It's the same type as that. So I guess
You don't need algebra or anything either. You just need your brain and arithmetic. right, really quick, let's come back together. Did anybody, after chatting with their neighbors, get the answer that they didn't have before? Is there anybody whose neighbor got to explain to them? We didn't really give you a ton of time. Yeah. All right, anybody that got the answer, either on their own or with their neighbors, who thinks they got it? All right, in the back, in the middle, what's your name?
Carlos?
Carlos, what do you think the answer is? I tried to do this at lunch. I've got what I think the answer is, but.
37.
37, I had 27. Anybody else have 27?
We had 29.
29? We can talk over snacks about what the correct answer is, or I can give you guys my reasoning. This is a medium hard, they're called area mazes. These are like they're kind of like Sudoku puzzles, but they're really big in Japan. Here's what I was hoping you would take away, at least for those of you guys who got the answer. How does it feel to go from not getting the answer to getting the answer? Carlos, how did you feel?
I think, well, this group represented it, but regarding to the state, because he claims that he got me 50%, 50%.
Yeah.
I was at 90%, he was 10%.
Yeah.
Very concerned about who was closer, who did more work to get.
So you wanted to immediately give out credit. So Plato is not going to be impressed. Did anybody feel like I kind of liked working on the problem? I liked working on it a little bit more when I got to talk to my neighbors. Or at least when I got to realize we were in the same boat with respect to this. Yeah, remind me your name? Thomas. So a little bit, how did it feel like talking with your neighbors about the problem?
It was good to have a little help with it and be able to make more connections with someone else.
Yeah, I mean, here's a cool thing about these puzzles. One, when you get the answer, it feels great to know something that was knowable that you didn't know before. That is a cool, distinctively human feeling. Like the squirrels outside Hesburgh Library, they don't ever have that feeling of wandering the area of the gray period and then reasoning their way to the truth of it and then delighting in discovering it and knowing that they've discovered it. Another thing that people can do is solve problems like this, especially like geometry problems, crossword puzzles. We can do them together in a way where we all have a common goal that we're kind of pointing towards. You often think of argument or logic or dialectic as something that pits people against each other. And that was what the sophists were doing. The sophists were at the end of the day, somebody's going to win the Sparta war vote and somebody's going to lose. And we're going to argue it out. And at the end of the day, you're either on the winning or the losing side. Truth is the kind of thing that divides people. It makes some people more powerful and some people weaker. Plato wants to remind people that that's not always how it has to be. There are other kinds of truths, in fact, the really good kinds, the objective truths out there that we can all seek together. And in fact, it's part of a good life. It makes us happy in a really human, rational way to go after that truth together. So do more math puzzles. That's your first Platonic lesson, but also this kind of beautiful vision of what it might be to care about the truth. That certainly mattered a lot to me when I was a college student. I had done debate in high school. I did it all through college. I was always very interested in rhetoric and very interested in zero-sum contests. But there's some part of our souls that can't think that the most important things in this life are all going to be zero-sum in those ways. And I think one of the most impressive things about Plato is this kind of idealism that there's something we could all jointly care about. That gets us into the second cool thing about Plato, and this is probably the most famous thing if anybody remembers learning Plato in college. This is the part they remember. It's the allegory of the cave. So you get to chapter 7, right at the start of chapter 7, Plato's trying to explain to you how to build the perfect city and fix your life so you can be permanently happy and answer a bunch of other questions in philosophy. And he hits pause and tells you this story of people in a cave. And I'm not going to lie, philosophers for the ensuing 2,000 years have not really been sure how to understand what is going on in the cave. So that makes it perfect for a talk like this because I can just tell you personally what the cave meant to me. But let me first give you the allegory of the cave, and if you got your books, you can check it out. It's the beginning of chapter 7, it's 514a. He launches into this story, and he says, picture, you've got men, they're dwelling in a kind of subterranean cavern. It's got a long entrance, imagine this really long tube. I always think of it kind of like an ant farm. And at the top of the tube, there's light. There's real, genuine light. And then you go a little bit further out, and there's candlelight. And you go further out, and there's the sunlight, real, genuine light. And Plato says, imagine these guys who are stuck in the cave. They've got their legs and their necks fettered from childhood. So since they're born. They're chained at the bottom of the cave, and their heads are immobilized, and their bodies, it's a weird story, get ready, it gets weirder. Their heads are immobilized, and they're stuck so that they're at the bottom of the cave, and they're looking at like the very back wall of the cave. So all the light sources are behind them. And then there are exhibitors of puppet shows in this cave, because why not? Like, this story is already making a ton of sense. And the puppet guys are behind the people who are chained in the cave. And the puppet guys have made puppet trees and puppet animals and puppet houses. And they're putting on this puppet show for the people that are chained in the cave. Why? Plato never tells us, but just go with it. So the people who've lived their entire lives in the cave looking at the puppet show, they think that this is their entire world. This is their entire reality. But then one day, one of the chained cave people gets free, climbs out. For some reason, he doesn't fight the puppeteers or anything. He just goes straight out, all the way up, out of the cave, into the blinding light. Plato says, when this guy first escapes the cave, it is going to really suck. Getting out of this situation, going from living in the shadow world to living in the light, is a blinding, difficult, painful experience. Here's what he says. I think this is a little bit down from in 514. Consider what would be the manner of the release and healing from these bonds and this folly if in the course of nature something of this sort should happen to them. If they were freed from their fetters and compelled to stand up suddenly and turn his head around and walk up to this life and his eyes shown to the light, and in doing all this he's going to feel pain. What do you suppose would be his answer if someone told him what he'd seen before was all a cheat, but that now, being nearer to reality, he saw more truly? So what would somebody say to somebody who just got out of the cave if they said, hey, guess what? Now you're in reality. Before you were living in a world of shadows. If someone should drag this guy up to the ascent, which is rough and steep, do you think that he would find it painful? Plato says there'd be a need for a while to get used to it. At first, this person would most easily discern shadows. He wouldn't be able to even see things in the light because he wouldn't be used to looking in the light. And after that, the likenesses are a reflection in water. Maybe he'd see that. And later, he'd be able to see the things in themselves. Finally, I suppose he'd be able to look upon the sun itself. And at this point, he would infer that this sun presides over all things in the visible region. This place says you get out of the cave. It's extremely painful. You have to learn to see everything in a new way. And in fact, for a while, you can only see the old stuff that you knew how to see. You don't know how to see the new things. And then eventually your eyes adjust. And then it's amazing. It's sublime. I mean, there's this whole world that you were unaware of in your cave existence that you now have the ability to apprehend. The cave analogy, a lot of people in metaphysics, which is my field in philosophy, want to read into this as theory, and there is a theory in there about the difference between reality and appearances and what's really real, and Plato's trying to speculate about that. That is not what I cared about when I was 20 years old and reading the Republic. I think one of the other readings of the allegory of the cave, which really resonated home for me, is a story that I think a lot of us experience when we go to college or when we experience an education for the first time, or just when we kind of change our worldview. It's the feeling of going through something that's extremely painful and then is really wonderful and then is really hard to explain. So for me, I went to college, went to the University of Virginia. I was from a pretty non-academic family. Grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina. Is anybody here from Greensboro? I was from a super loving but not super nerdy academic family. When I went to college, I had a vision of what a good life would be that was really focused on the values and my understanding of the world that I had when I was 16, 17 years old in Greensboro. If you want to live a good life as an adult, you have a really great professional life, you make a lot of money, you have a family, you have relative security, a lot of things that my family frankly struggled to have when I was a high school student growing up. I got to college, and my first year or two of college, living apart for the first time, being exposed to new ideas and new people, having like the time and freedom and opportunity to think seriously about who I was and what I wanted to be, I changed dramatically my first years of college. I went from thinking my destiny on planet Earth was to be a high-paying attorney to thinking that maybe I would study professional metaphysics for the rest of my life. I converted to Catholicism. I changed in many different ways from the values that my parents had raised me with, not in bad ways, but in ways that made me think about the world in a really different way. The process of getting an education is like this for everyone. Any true education, the kind of education Plato's thinking about, where you're expanding your ability to perceive things in the world, it's not always the funnest or easiest experience. And in fact, that process of going through the transition from not really understanding to starting to understand yourself and the world that you live in can be extraordinarily painful. I think one of the reasons why I read The Allegory of the Cave over and over and over again is when I'm 20, 21 years old, is because you can identify in some respect with that prisoner of thinking like, I realize I'm getting out, I'm moving towards something, I think it's a good thing, but I don't understand it at all yet. And in the process, you're becoming alienated and really different from the people who are back in the cave. And this is the weirdest part of the allegory of the cave, the one that philosophers really struggle to understand. It doesn't have anything to do with metaphysics. When Plato gets to the end of the allegory of the cave, he says the guy that escapes and his eyes adjust and he can finally see in the light, what does he have to do? What does Plato say? He has to go back. And what happens when he goes back? They hate him. I mean, they might kill him. It's really unclear. Violence happens. Nobody believes him. I can't imagine, I did have the experience going home each successive year for college, for Christmas break, summer break, and being back with my old friends, being back with the context of my family. And every year, I'm changing dramatically. Every year that you guys are in college, you are changing dramatically. And every year, it's like going back down into the cave and thinking like, man, I'm super different. I can't even explain to you guys what's going on in my head right now, or what I'm realizing about myself, or what I'm thinking about the world. And that is also a painful experience. But one of the things that's really remarkable about Plato, I think, is that he includes that line, that you've got to go back. He's somebody that really respects the truth, really respects education, but thinks you can't live in this isolated, like, sunlight bubble the rest of your life. You have to take that transformation that you get from your education, and you have to go back down into the darkness, where guess what? You can't see anymore. Also, your eyes have changed and your pupils have dilated, or not. I don't know how eyes work. Your pupils have changed in such a way so you can't even see in the cave. You can't navigate the cave life anymore. You have to trust in the fact that like whatever your transformation is, it's durable enough or important enough to survive those dark periods. I think one of the reasons I loved the Republic so much when I was in college is because I felt like I was facing a lot of those dark periods. And this is a book where Plato thinks like he's a fellow traveler in that. Third thing you should love about the Republic, I hope, and this will get us into a final set of quotes. This is what you should really take away from the Republic, and this is what I think about constantly when I reread it now as an adult. The Republic asks one of the most important questions that human beings have ever thought to ask, and this happens in the second chapter, so you don't even have to read all the way to 7 to get this one. Socrates has been fighting with Thrasymachus, and he's been fighting about the nature of truth in the first chapter. And then Thrasymachus, I think, gets frustrated and goes back to the party. They're always going to and from parties. Socrates is also drunk in a lot of these dialogues. So Thrasymachus goes back to the party, and Socrates keeps walking. And he starts talking with two other characters, Glaucon and Adeimantus. And Glaucon and Adeimantus, they're not like Thrasymachus. They're not jerks. They're not sophists. They're genuinely just concerned with doing philosophy with Socrates. But they're also not pushovers. Sometimes you read the Platonic dialogues and Socrates, like as soon as Socrates starts talking, everybody shuts up and starts taking notes. In chapter 2 of the Republic, you get a really cool thing. Socrates meets people who also care about the truth, but are willing to ask hard questions with him. And Glaucon asks the best question. It's like, Socrates, you keep going around telling people they should care about the truth. They should care about being genuinely good people. But why? Why should we care about being genuinely good people or care about the truth itself rather than just wanting a reputation for being good people? Just wanting the kinds of things that we need to get what we really want in this life. Why should we care about the goodness or truth itself? If you guys take God in the Good Life, we do devote a whole class to like yelling at you about like, you should agree with Socrates on this. But it's an open question about why any of us in our heart of hearts should care about truth and goodness by itself rather than just wanting a reputation for being good people. All you need is a reputation for being good in order to get a great job, in order to have friends, in order to make a lot of money. Why should you care at the end of the day about anything other than just being known as somebody who's a good person? And that's the question that Socrates gets asked. And the question that Plato really, wrings his hands over. The whole Republic, in its heart of heart, is not trying to tell you how to start a totalitarian dictatorship. It's trying to figure out how on earth we can answer that question. One thing that has occurred to me a lot over the years as I've read and reread the Republic and read and reread scriptures is there's like something in the air in humanity around this period of 6th, 5th, 4th century BC, where we were all starting to wonder, are there any things in this world that are good in and of themselves? If you reread like the wisdom literature in the Old Testament, some of the most philosophical parts of the Bible, you see the Jewish people wrestling with this question. So in the book of Job, I'm always struck by how the book of Job maps onto the 2nd chapter of the Republic. Book of Job starts off with this story. You've got the tempter is talking with God. God saying, look at Job. Job loves me so much. Job is like my best guy. And the tempter says, Job only likes you because you keep giving him things. This is a paraphrase. I'm also not an Old Testament scholar. It's a paraphrase. Tempter says, Satan says, Job only likes you because you keep giving him stuff. He's got a beautiful family. He's got a prosperous farm. He's got a lot of sheep. If you didn't always give Job external benefits, if there was nothing in it for Job anymore, Job wouldn't care about you. Job definitely wouldn't worship you. And God says, well, let's put him to the test. And so then the book of Job gets super weird, and the way of the Republic gets super weird. We're asked to imagine Job without any of God's benefits accruing to Job anymore. So God kills all of Job's kids, gives him boils. All of his friends think that he's a bad person, so he loses all of his friends. He loses his reputation for being a holy person. And then the rest of the book of Job is meditating on like what is left of Job and God, even when all of the external benefits of being known as a good person are gone. In the Republic, you see the exact same thing in chapter 2. So Glaucon's giving Socrates a hard time. Why care so much about being good? Let's imagine somebody who really is a good person, Glaucon says, but everybody thinks they're a bad person. So they don't get any of the external benefits of a reputation for goodness, but they are really good in their hearts. You're legitimately trying to tell me, Socrates, that that would be a life worth living. And Socrates holds his ground. He says, yeah, like goodness in and of itself is something that is worth going for, and I'm going to try to prove it. How does he prove it? I mean, he gives you math problems to try to remind you that you still care about things that don't involve your reputation. That helps a little bit. He also tries to remind you that you like have a soul, that you have a self, that you care about looking a certain way. One of the ways he does this most persuasively, I think, and most funny way, is near the end of the Republic, he describes people who are not taking good care of their souls. They're not taking good care of themselves. You get, he talks about the person with the democratic soul, which is like 3 of my friends on Facebook. What's the passage? Here's the passage of the person with the democratic soul. This is how the person spends his days. Here we go. Think about which of your friends this reminds you of. The person with the soul who's not really governed by justice, he lives from day to day, indulging in the appetite of the hour. Sometimes he's drunk and he's absorbed in strains of the flute. Sometimes he's drinking water and he's trying to diet. Then he takes a turn at gymnastics. Sometimes he's idling and he's neglecting everything. Then sometimes he's deciding he's living the life of the philosopher. Often he's busy with politics, so he's picking fights on social media. Then sometimes he starts to his feet and he says and does whatever is coming into his head. And if he envies anyone who is a warrior, then he's off in that direction. And if he envies men of business, then once more he's headed off in that direction. He doesn't have any law or any order, and he's not distracted. And in this distracted existence, he thinks his life is happy and blissful and free, and so he goes on and lives it. Plato says, imagine this person who's always moved by like whatever the thing of the day is, the thing that is, like culture is calling good, your friends or the particular bubble that you're part of is calling good. Imagine how you'd live your life if you were always moving in those directions. And he says you're going to have this like really disordered, disorganized life that's not going to be at all close to good, though you might tell yourself the lie that it is. Plato says you want to be the kind of person who's got a soul that's ruled by justice, the kind of person who's got a soul that's frankly capable of living both outside the cave and inside the cave, because that like well-ordered soul itself is something that if you were a really good person, if you were somebody who really wanted to be happy, you would value. I don't know what to make of it. I mean, this is not a homily either. There's no like pat answers to this. But as far as bits of philosophy that I was exposed to when I was young that I still think about constantly, this passage of Plato, this idea of wanting to be the kind of person who has a soul that's valuable to you, like a way of life that's valuable in and of itself, that's capable of withstanding all the slings and arrows of fortune. If God takes away my sheep, I'd still like have something in my life that was worth loving about God. If it turns out that all of my friends turn on me or that the politics of the day turn against me, I still have something that I would really love about justice, that I would know in my heart was like the truth, something that could withstand any kind of misfortune. That's something that Plato desperately wanted this. He was very nervous that nobody else cared about it in his time. And I think that everybody's felt that way. That's a feeling that people have in the year 2019, just as much as a feeling that we had in 375 BC. Just as a bit of closing remarks, and then I'm interested in what you guys think about this. When I think about why the Republic is an amazing book now, to me personally, and not just as a great piece of philosophy, it's a book that challenges me to want to work to be the kind of person who loves the truth and the good and God in and of themselves. And it's a good reminder that having a self and having a soul is not something that just happens to you. It's something that you work on, and it's something that requires you to think quite a bit about what you really love and desire and whether or not those are pointing in the right direction. How many of you guys have read David Foster Wallace? Anybody? David Foster Wallace is like very far from being a Platonist. A lot of his stuff, a lot of his really good philosophical essays defend a super sophisticated kind of relativism, which in and of itself is very interesting. But he has one line in This Is Water, his really famous commencement speech, that I think for me captures one of the reasons why I love reading and rereading Plato. So I thought I would leave this with you guys tonight, especially because it has to do with what it means to be getting an education. So Wallace says, and This Is Water, "This, I submit, is the freedom of a real education, of learning how to be genuinely well-adjusted. You get to consciously decide what has meaning and what doesn't, and you get to decide what to worship." I read Plato as somebody who's trying for himself and for all of the people that he's teaching in the academy and the people he's trying to convince with this book, both in 375 BC and in 2019 AD, to try to like light that flicker in us of thinking seriously about what we're genuinely going to love and worship, and looking for the kinds of things that might be like imperturbable, like the truth. And that I think is still worth like fighting for and thinking about, and that's a reason to read the otherwise completely crazy Republic. Thank you. Yeah, don't ask any hard interpretive questions. I'll take a stab at it. What is techne? Carl? No. Yeah.
You said that you're a convert to Catholicism. How it has it all? How has the Republic sort of adjusted how you view your own religion and sort of helped you along in your faith life?
Well, that's a great question. What's your name?
Luke.
Luke. This is like a Freudian question, I feel like. I've talked about this a little bit before. Converting to Catholicism was obviously a huge event in my life. And it happened at the same time that I was coming to love philosophy, but in my mind at the time, in that phase of college, they were two really different parts of my life, and parts of my life that I tried to keep really separate. So I'll give you like the short, there's always like the long answer. Like the short answer, I came into the church my third year of college. I got really interested in Catholicism my second year of college, same time I was reading Republic. What got me interested, what first like drew me into the church were all of the non-philosophical things about Catholicism. So I was feeling very desolate. I was feeling a really strong urge to look for meaning, but I wasn't thinking of it that way in my life at the time. I was feeling like I needed something that was missing. Went to Mass at a Dominican-run parish that was near where I lived, the dormitory I lived at the time, and was immediately struck by the Eucharist and prayer and just being in that space with people who were worshiping, and it just seemed like there was a frequency people were vibrating on in that holy place that I had been looking for and had not experienced yet in my life. And this is super embarrassing as a philosopher, but I never went through the right amount of skeptical or learning period before joining the church. It's kind of like I went And I loved it, and I kept going back on Wednesdays, which was the first day that I'd gone to the service, and then liked it even more, so I started going on Sundays and started talking to the Dominican priests, and then did RCIA and came into the church all in this like heart, like gut way. Didn't read any like church councils. I know some people who become Catholic because they like read a bunch of arguments and decide the evidence is on the side of Catholic. I did not do that. I didn't. In fact, I actively avoided it because I was worried if I started thinking too hard about it, it would kind of extinguish the flame. At the same time, I'm becoming a philosopher, and I just try to keep those parts of my life really separate. But now I look back and see that as part of a common narrative, and I was moved. As a graduate student, I read the Confessions for the first time. I never read St. Augustine before that. And there's a line in the Confessions where Augustine says he's really glad that he got things in the right order to prepare him to really understand the gospel. And there's I don't even know where it is in the Confessions. There's a throwaway line where he's like, it was a good idea I went through my Plato period before I converted to Christianity, because it helped give me the framework that I would eventually need to understand some really hard questions I was going to have about Christianity down the road after conversion. And like God gave me the right doses in the right order, so it all makes sense to me down the road. And I think that's probably been true of my journey too. I was studying lots of philosophy, and I was definitely starting to become concerned with these bigger existential questions as a college student. And I was learning how to reason, and I was learning how to care about the truth, and learning how to ask and answer hard questions, and learning to not be afraid of them. But, it was still a Padawan. I'm really into Star Wars. I was still like a baby Jedi and not capable of fighting the really big, really hard questions, the ones that are going to hit really close to home, the ones that are going to keep you up in the middle of the night. I wasn't ready to do philosophy about those when I was 19, 20 years old. But I was learning how other people had done it. And then by the time I got into graduate school, and by the time I became a much more mature Catholic and was able to reason about some of the really hard questions I had about evil and suffering and God, I was really glad that I had Plato and Aristotle and Kant and these other philosophical figures to give me some tools for doing that work. But when I was 19, 20 years old, I had to keep those as separate as possible. And I don't know how much you guys go through these battles with faith and reason. I think one thing that sometimes at Notre Dame we make appear too easy is this tension between living a life of genuine faith and living a life of like philosophical reason. I think, that faith and reason are meant to be consistent, and these parts of our lives, the part of our lives that seeks evidence and seeks the truth, and our hearts that draw us toward God, they're meant to work together, but that is not easy. And anybody who feels like this, like these two parts of their life are totally complementary is all the time and doesn't have to worry about it is probably not working one of them hard enough. Either they're not taking the commitments of their faith seriously enough, or they're not realizing how demanding it is to care about the truth. So that's a long answer to your question, but yeah, I wish I had been more philosophically courageous when I was converting. I was a total wuss about it. I would like, somebody would bring up the problem of evil, and I'd be like, that seems like a real problem. It seems like a really bad problem. And now I'm kind of smug about it. Yeah.
Hi. So I think you said you were studying pre-law in your undergrad?
Yeah, I really wanted to be a lawyer.
So if that was, if it was in like your sophomore year that you started both finding Catholicism and like discovering philosophy.
Yeah. You can be a Catholic lawyer too. You can. Yeah. It's totally cool.
That's a lot of changes.
Yeah.
So like, when was it that you realized you wanted to make that switch to like making philosophy your life?
Oh man, exactly simultaneously. This is why there's definitely a story that's happening there that I'm just not connecting the dots at this phase of my life. But my third year of college, I came into the church on Easter, which is what you do if you're an RCIA convert. And like 3 weeks before Easter, I called my parents and dropped both bombs on them at once. Talk about like going back down into the cave and then people yelling at you. This was 3 weeks before Easter, my third year of college. I called my parents and I'd be like, hey, guess what? I've been doing this whole joining the Catholic Church thing, and there's going to be this 3.5 hour long middle of the night mass that I'm going to be part of, and people are inviting their families. You can come to it if you want. And also, I'm not going to be a lawyer. I'm going to go to philosophy graduate school and live on $20,000 a year through most of my 20s so that I can better understand how many existential quantifiers there are. any questions? And they were like, what happened? I mean, this is totally the going back down into the cave experience. They're like, we thought everything was going one direction, and now our kid is this complete mutant. And my parents are absolutely the bomb at being parents. They were dealt 3 very different children. I have 2 brothers who were all very, very different from each other. And my parents just kind of rolled with it. They came up for the Easter Vigil, though at the end of the day, only one of my parents and one of my brothers could sit through the Mass. And they didn't ask me any hard questions, though they definitely kind of scratched their head. And they were surprisingly cool about the grad school thing. My dad asked me multiple times if I had talked to my professors about whether this was a good idea. And I told them that they thought it was a good idea too. But yeah, the two big events, they definitely came to a climax at the same time in my life, which makes it that much like weirder that at that time, if you ask me how I thought about it, these are like really different things. One of them is a personal thing, totally personal. The other is like my professional destiny. And it really wasn't until later on, until like my late 20s, I felt like I had the confidence to try to push those pieces closer together. Yeah.
What is the best regime?
What is the best regime? Oof. Oligarchy, he skips over it so quickly. I don't know. We shouldn't let philosophers run things. If you've ever been to a philosophy department faculty meeting, Carl, I mean, there's no way philosophers should govern anything. We barely can govern ourselves. We can't even decide like how many classes we're going to offer, let alone like how to distribute justice. That's not what Plato thinks. So Plato's political philosophy is pretty screwed up. What do you think it is? What's your name?
Oh, Brennan.
Brennan, where's your bet right now? I mean, democracy's bad if you can't be confident people are good people, and everybody is trying to be a good person, but some of us are really failing worse than others at the moment. I don't know.
How about Aristotelian polity? How about that?
Yeah.
Small, homogeneous community.
Oh, that's such an ethics and culture answer. I don't know. You read about Aristotle. On the one hand, the homogeneity worries me. It definitely seems like it's a little bit boring. Like Aristotle's really small communities of people who are all friends with each other. They're all like friends of virtue. They're all like, you know, they're having like little circles where they talk about how they're working on being more courageous. Plato's Republic is way more exciting than the vision that we're getting from Aristotle, partly. I also think there's no way we're going to make the Aristotelian project work in 2019. The fact that we're a really connected global society with really different cultures and really different ideas. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's actually a pretty cool thing. I think it's really, when I was in college, the thought of going on like a 2-week study abroad trip to China, that was not conceivable. We still had to go to travel agents before we went to Europe when I was in college and like get a ticket issued to you by a travel agent. Now we live in a world where you guys can become really interested in Chinese politics and go to Beijing for 2 weeks and experience a different culture and meet those people. It's good that we live in a really connected society. And the Greeks had the idea of empire, but they didn't have this idea of how wonderful it would be to encounter difference and how that would give us lots of really interesting fodder for thinking about the truth and for asking questions that we weren't considering before. How that's actually one of the most practical ways that we get ourselves out of the cave right now is being interested in other people. But what kind of government you need to keep that all ticking along? Gosh, that's like the $1 million question, right? That's a question of our whole century. Democracy for Plato is like, well, it's the 3rd worst form of government. It could get worse, right? There's tyranny. That's definitely bad. But democracy is not as good as we could possibly do. It might be the best idea we've come up with so far. But yeah, I don't know. The really small, like circle the wagons, that's not an option. That's not a viable option for me. It seems like that's a great way to make sure you only end up in like level 2 of the cave. Yeah?
Are there any places besides the Book of Job where you found a parallel between the Republic and the Bible?
Oh my gosh, this is a question I should have a more thoughtful answer to, given that I'm a philosophy professor and a Catholic. The Job is the one I think about the most often. Because there's a line in like book 2 of the Republic where Glaucon, he's really putting the screws to Socrates, and he's like, no, seriously, Socrates, like let's imagine a guy who's really just, but everybody thinks he's unjust, and they're gonna poke his eyes out, and they're gonna burn him with tongs, and they're gonna take away all of his property, and he's gonna lose. It sounds just like Job. Like let's imagine all of the worst possible external things are gonna happen to this person who internally loves justice. And you're still going to tell me this guy has a good life. which is the question Job presents to us in such stark terms. You're still going to tell me God is worth loving, even if God allows all of this evil to befall you. Certainly, all of Scripture is thinking seriously about the problem of evil. There's no single part of the Christian tradition that's not wrestling with the fact that our lives are difficult, that we face seemingly pointless suffering, and that we're still called to like hope in light of that. So if you think about the message of the Republic as being like, find something that is worth caring about even despite all of the appearances that you should give up, then that's like all of Scripture is trying to help us answer that question as well, which is why Christian philosophers, as soon as they encountered Plato, realized like this is going to be extremely valuable. People like Augustine for understanding our situation. But other like particularly Platonic things, I'd have to think a little bit more about that. It's a good question. So, every time I read St. Paul, whichever philosopher is on my mind, I read into Paul. Especially, Paul is such a creature of the Greek and Roman worlds. So if you've been reading Stoicism recently, you suddenly notice all this Stoic stuff in Paul's letters. If you've been reading Plato recently, like Through a Glass Darkly, the world of reality versus the world of appearances, you start picking up those notes. So certainly you can draw those connections with Paul. The Gospels, it's hard because Jesus is just his own philosopher. He defies any quick assimilation to any of the other traditions. But that's a really good question.
Got time for one more.
Yeah. Yeah. Carlos, who thinks he got the answer. We got to do it. Now we got to like go figure it out at the break. 37? All right. Well, just based on testimony, we have to like check that. I want to see. The whole point of the Republic is we want to see your reasoning. Yeah.
In your work with young people today, what do you think is the most effective or the most effective ways you can help people care about the truth in today's society and culture?
Yeah. This is a great question. I mean, Plato's an educator. He spent so much of the Republic as a book about philosophy of education, like what is the best way to raise better people. And some of the stuff he says is really extreme, but you also have to admire the fact that he was really thinking seriously about this. If we want to help somebody live a genuinely good life, have a genuinely great soul, what kinds of practical things should we do with them early on to help them get ready to be able to do that? So I disagree with Plato on a couple points. First off, I don't think you have to like withhold poetry from toddlers because it might corrupt them. Like, some of the stuff he says is really nuts. But when I think about educating at least college students or people who are like late teens through early 20s on this question of the good life, there are a couple key things that you get from Socrates and Plato that are still very much great tips today. First one, probably the most important of them all, is what we started with, asking strong questions. Like teaching people that they can ask questions that they're genuinely not sure of the answer to and be interested in what they learn as a result. And that is a skill. That is not something that's really obvious how to do. The way I think about it most in my own life is it's a skill to be a great conversation partner at a dinner party. I don't know how many of you guys go to a lot of dinner parties. At Notre Dame, this time of year, you go to a dinner party every freaking night of the week. It's like a Christmas party. And it is a skill to be a good guest at a party and to be able to meet a stranger and carry on a conversation that is genuinely interesting with them and has a point, a conversation that people want to be part of. And it's partially about just asking really interesting questions. Like, what's an example of an interesting cocktail party question? I'm not really good at this. I'd be like, do you know any good gossip? Or you can say like, would you rather, I don't know, do you think it's ethical to eat meat? That's probably a bad one to start a dinner party with. But you would ask questions where you're genuinely concerned what the other person thinks. And maybe you know enough about them to think that they might have the answer. We get this from Socrates. Socrates is like in love with questions. And most of the time when we ask questions, we're asking questions just because we want to say something, or we want to hear ourselves, or we want to make a point, or we want to belittle someone. The Greeks definitely knew that that was the most common, like our instinctive way of conversing with other people, and that we had to learn how to be more curious and more interested. So that's one thing, and I think we learned that in college. You learn that by having really great seminars. You learn that by reading people who asked awesome questions like Glaucon. Why should we try to be good people? So I think that's one key technique, and that's part of like growing your souls, growing your curiosity, growing your desire to try to figure out what's really true with other people. I think another crucial skill that philosophers can help us all live better lives by developing is to help, and this is really hard to put in practice, but it's the very idealistic version, to remind people that they have souls. So this is the best lines in Socrates are all where he's giving his speeches. And he's saying, remember, Athenians, yeah, you're rich, you have wonderful reputations, you're really good at naval battles, but there's more to life than that. There's also just this fact that you are existing as a rational creature in this world and the miracle of that. And that's something that should be fed, and that's something, a part of you that can be educated. All of your education and all of your striving is not just for these like simple intermediate goals, but for some bigger goal. And I don't know, I mean, you guys can tell me if I'm a professional preacher on this question, but my youngest brother is a 4th year in college. He's at Brown. He's just getting ready to graduate. And watching him go through his 4 years at college as somebody that loves him, I feel like you cannot say to people in that phase of life enough that they have souls and that those souls are valuable and that people care about them and that there's more to life than just like the pressures of the moment. And that's partially because, especially for young people, you guys have it really hard. Like one of the hardest phases of life to navigate is this period of your life where you're on your own and you're trying to figure out your heading, you're trying to figure out your career, your family structure, all of these big adult decisions that are going to crystallize eventually and form your values and form your life. You guys are in the hot zone for having to make those decisions right now. And it's really hard to do. And I think that one thing philosophers can do and one thing that people that care about the souls of young people can do is just remind folks that they have souls when at the pressures of focusing on everything external can be so intense. So those are maybe 2 things. Third thing is like books are cool and you don't have to synthesize your own antibiotics. You don't have to like come up with solutions to these big philosophical or existential questions on your own. There are dead people who had pretty decent ideas that are worth at least like Googling before you go off and try to come up with your own plan for the meaning of life. And so also like playing this role of reminding you to be curious about how other people have dealt with the same cards, existential cards that they got dealt in their own lives. Yeah, if you have other ideas about why philosophy is valuable, let me know.
Friends, please join me in thanking Professor Sullivan.
Yeah, thank you guys.